Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you have the microphones and you're connected to channel 2. Okay, good afternoon and welcome to this session on the impact of war and climate on water security in Ukraine. And we have the honor on behalf of the World Bank to present this session, auspiciously also on Ukraine's Independence Day. So happy independence to Ukraine. What the session, why we were encouraged and inspired to do this session was that the theme of this year's Stockholm World Water Week is about the seeds of innovation and innovation in water, even in times like this. And so what we want to really showcase to you is how we used innovative tools to analyze the impact of the invasion on Ukraine's water sector, as well as what's happening simultaneously with climate change, these double shocks that are hitting the country. So the objectives of this session are to showcase some of the results of that work. We will start off with some opening remarks, then we'll move into a presentation by the World Bank, and then we'll have a open panel discussion with participants from the Ukrainian authorities of water resources and Ministry of Agriculture, as well as yourselves. So throughout this session, you will see moments where we have asked you to get involved in our presentation. There'll be a polev, so we kindly ask all of you to answer the questions and also participate in the panel discussion. So thank you very much for being here. Without further ado, I want to introduce Dr. Winston Yu, who's the practice manager for water in the World Bank for the Water GP in Europe and Central Asia for some opening remarks. Over to you, Winston.
Okay, thank you. Can everyone hear? It's okay? Okay, so I hope my English is being translated into better English for all of you. You know, when I first started working in Ukraine, this is about 2012, I was coming from India. And for those of you who are familiar with the geography of India and the irrigation sector in India, typically you're dealing with small, less than a hectare of land subsistence farms, huge systems, lots of challenges with getting water down to tail ends, I mean, so forth and so forth. And I remember landing in Kiev and then very quickly going to the field in the southern parts where you start to see sprinklers, you see high efficiency irrigation, big commercial farms of tens of thousands of hectares. And in fact, sometimes we would go and talk to some of the producers there, and you know, they'd have huge numbers of staff running these systems. And all of that against the backdrop, if you look at the agriculture sector in Ukraine, only a very small percentage of that agriculture is irrigated. And in fact, we're talking on the order of a couple percentage points. And so we were brought in at the time to really start to help the government think about the future of agriculture and future of irrigation. And I think what you'll see today from these presentations is that certainly in the southern parts of Ukraine, more irrigation is going to be needed, more reliable services, greater deliveries, because as we all know, with climate change, much more uncertainty. And so, for us at the World Bank at that time, again, this is around 2012, there was always this question about, well, which farmers are we dealing with? Obviously our mission, which is about a world free of poverty and really trying to provide better services and benefits and help support livelihoods for the marginal and smaller farmers. That was an agenda that the government was asking us to support them on. I had been traveling down to Crimea and met with many farmers who were not happy with the services, and you would find what systems that did exist quite in disrepair. Okay, so much of the infrastructure not performing to the levels that was observed, decades ago. Pumps falling into disrepair, can't find parts, et cetera, et cetera. So a huge agenda as we saw it. Fast forward to today, and I'll just share with you one number, $400 billion. And I don't know if you have a sense of $400 billion, it's a big chunk of money. This is the estimated needs for the reconstruction effort in Ukraine, 400 billion over 10 years. And if you look at the rapid damage and needs assessment report that was prepared by the World Bank, it's all public, just Google, you can find it. A lot of that investment is to rebuild the transport sectors, rebuild energy sectors, social infrastructure, homes, schools, health facilities, et cetera, et cetera. And of that 400 billion, we're talking about roughly 7 billion needed to restore water supply, wastewater services, and 9 billion for agriculture, for irrigation, infrastructure, drainage infrastructure, and so forth. And so when we start to think about the reconstruction effort, hopefully that will start as soon as possible, I think many of our colleagues are thinking about, well, what will the build back look like? And can we really build back better? And so I hope that this session will shed some light on that question and show you what we can do. Obviously a lot of this work has been done not from the field, but how we can mobilize remote sensing technologies, how we can use data analytics to help us paint a picture on what the future will look like and what we need to do to support Ukraine and its agricultural development. I also want to thank, in particular, our guests who will be online from Kiev. I'm every day impressed that even though there's a war happening, we're still very much in touch with them every day to support them and help them think about what the next phase of Ukraine will look like. And so with that, I'll turn back to Ranu, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Winston. Thank you for those inspiring remarks, Winston. So we'll keep that question through a thread throughout this presentation and the panel discussion, can we build back better? But before we start thinking about building back better, we try to understand, okay, what has happened so far? And that's what you're going to see presented next. This is the agenda for the presentation, split into 3 parts. The first part will be presented for us to use remote sensing technologies, satellite imagery, to understand the impact of the invasion to the irrigation sector in Ukraine. That will be co-presented by myself, Senior Water Resources Management Specialist at the World Bank, based in the Water GP in Tbilisi, Georgia, and Silvan. Please introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Silvan Ragetli. I'm from Hydro Solutions. I'm a remote sensing expert, and on behalf of the World Bank, I carried out the remote sensing analysis to look at the impact of the invasion on irrigated agriculture in Ukraine.
Thank you. The second part of the presentation will talk about the climate change impacts, which we think is an equally important, if not more long-term shock that is hitting the Ukrainian economy and particularly the agriculture sector. That will be presented by my colleague Pulat.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Pulat Karimi. I'm a senior irrigation specialist with the World Bank based in Washington, D.C.
Thank you. And we'll just conclude with a few summary of the findings and a few remarks of the way forward. Okay, so we'll start with talking about the invasion assessment. Winston mentioned a rapid damage needs assessment, which we looked at quantitatively. We tried to quantify the damages. You heard this 400 billion number. We tried to break that down for the irrigation sector. But we also did a bit of qualitative assessment, and we'll explain that. Then we go into the remote sensing analysis. And recently, of course, you all know of the Kakhovka Dam explosion. So we looked a little bit at what does that mean for irrigated agriculture in Ukraine. Okay, so like I mentioned, we really want you to be part of this presentation. So if you could all of you get out your mobiles, join the POLEV. If you scan the QR code, you'll be able to log into the POLEV. And we'll start with our first question in just a moment. Give me a thumbs up when you think you're connected. All of you, great, great. See most of you connected. And don't worry, the QR code comes back on some of the questions if you have trouble logging in. We'll go to the first question. Okay, quiz. So before the invasion, what percentage of Ukraine's agriculture do you think was irrigated? I like to walk, so sorry, the microphone doesn't follow me. What percentage of Ukraine's agricultural land do you think was irrigated? A, less than 2%, between 10 to 20, more than 50%, or none of the above? Okay, we have a lot of responses coming in. Well, I think there's more than 40 people, so I think some online participants are also there, so welcome. Okay. All right, we'll give it another second. Hit 50. All right, okay. You're coming in slowly now. Let's see the response. Okay, we're at 50, great. Right, okay, excellent. So we have of all the 50 participants, I think a majority, all right, it's going up. It seems that the majority of the audience thinks that it's B, between 10 and 20%. And a bit split between less than 2 and more than 50. Well, the A's have it. It's less than 2%. And now we're going to explain some of the implications of that in just a moment. Okay, so like I mentioned, we're going to start by talking about this rapid damage needs assessment. And what we did, first of all, is try to understand the map of Ukraine in terms of the different areas of the invasion. How does it look? How does it break down? With 2 layers. The first is to look at, okay, what is the total amount of cropland, rain-fed, irrigated, agricultural cropland in Ukraine? And that's a huge number, 25 million hectares. However, if you look at the map, if you see the green area around Kherson, as of 2021 data, we could see that that was around 400,000 hectares. Out of that 25 million, that's about 1.7%. That's why the A's had it. Less than 2% of that agricultural land was irrigated. And it's mostly concentrated in this southern and southern eastern area. Zaporizhzhia a little bit, mostly Kherson. And we'll help you understand why the Kakhovka Dam is so important in just a moment. But then let's look at the color coding on this map. So if you look at this light pink and dark pink area, and of course this map is already outdated. The situation is changing so fast we can't keep this map up to date. But this is as of March 2023. The areas in light pink and dark pink are the areas and territories with ongoing hostilities and areas that are temporarily not under government control. That is exactly where the irrigation systems and irrigated areas, the rich irrigated areas of Ukraine are. Okay, let's break down some of these numbers. So this is the culmination of 1 year's analysis. From February 2022, at the start of the invasion, to February 2023. This is now published, as Winston mentioned, and we broke the irrigation, drainage, and water resources sector impact into 3 categories: damages, losses, and needs. So what the damages is showing is a quantification of exactly the physical infrastructure damage. We quantify the direct cost of damage to physical infrastructure of irrigation, drainage, flood protection assets. And that's only the areas we could access by some local government data, satellite data. So this number of 380 million, we think is far lower than what is the reality on the ground, because we could only get access in many of those pink areas. The government no longer has access to data in those areas. So, but in at least 15 out of 25 oblasts, we could see direct damages to physical infrastructure, which is coming up to around, this is only as of 1 year, 12 months of the invasion, 380 million. And 90% of this is kind of concentrated in 6 oblasts. So there's a concentrated area of direct damages. Now losses. Losses is a bit different. It's calculated in terms of the economic losses to the government, in terms of revenues loss resulting from operational losses from profit. In terms of crop losses, this is calculated by our agriculture team. This is another very large number, but this is separated in our methodology. That's around another 282 million. The needs, so Winston mentioned this 400 billion, and out of this, around 9 billion is needed over the next 10 years to build the irrigation, drainage, and water resources systems back better in Ukraine. And why you're seeing such a huge number, 8.9 billion, when the damages are at 380 million, we'll explain that. Because when you build back better, you don't reconstruct exactly as it was, what was damaged. So that's one. Two, we have a story of expansion in Ukraine. There is a need, because what happened, unfortunately, is some of the richest and largest irrigation systems, such as in Crimea, are temporarily not under government control. So there's a story of irrigation expansion. There are some limitations. We couldn't look at, unfortunately, river basin management, water quality, which will, of course, inflate these numbers. But largely, if you look at the pie chart, in the yellow, more than 50%, the damage is to the irrigation sector. And the others are divided evenly between drainage, more or less, buildings and equipment, and flood protection. Now, I mentioned that we did this quantitative analysis. We also did on-the-ground field surveys with areas that were brought back under government control. And we worked with an incredible team in Ukraine, the NGO Primavera and the Institute for Water Problems, who went out and surveyed individually farmers to understand, because we wanted to get a picture not of state infrastructure that's publicly owned, but what's happening to farmers, what's happening to their private farms and their infrastructure. And of course, you all know well the story so far about all the damages that are going on. But in this period of early spring, we talked to some local agencies and we did some surveys. So I just want to share the voice of one farmer. And Winston mentioned this, you'll see that this one farm had 1,400 hectares. And that's not an anomaly in Ukraine. They're large farms. But this is one farmer sharing his story with us and sharing photos of center pivots damaged. He was growing winter wheat with his center pivot irrigation system. There was damages to the surface layer of his soil, large craters, so inability to grow there, probably for a very long time. His costly infrastructure across this 1,400 hectares, which is a large scale, completely gone. And of course, the economic losses that farm is facing. Loss of production, infrastructure, warehouses, storage facilities, and loss of employment. Because the labor, a large part of what we do in agriculture, as many of you know, is about contracting labor. And that labor is no longer available. I'm going to hand it over to Silvan now for the remote sensing analysis.
So for the quantitative assessment at the country scale, how did we do that? We used public remote sensing data, freely available, to look at the impact of the invasion on irrigated areas, cropped areas, changes in irrigation water use, and agricultural production. So how did we do that? We used, at the first step, we used optical remote sensing data from the Sentinel fleet, so the European Space Agency. We used 10-meter resolution satellite images to map the total cropland of Ukraine and the main crop types. And within the cropland, we mapped the area that is irrigated. So we obtain a layer of irrigated and rain-fed cropland. And then we combined these maps with freely available global data set on evapotranspiration from the United States Geological Survey, available at the 30-meter resolution, that allows us to quantify how much is actual crop water use and how much of this comes from irrigation. And then we also look at the productivity of the irrigation sector and so we can compare, also assess what's the difference of irrigated yield versus rain-fed yield of the same crop types. And for this, we used data from the EU Global Land Cover Service, data on productivity, on biomass productivity. And all these data sets then were validated against data collected by the government, so census data and crop statistics. So we obtain a validated data set at the country scale, the high spatial resolution, over the last 6 years. The annual layers include 2022, but not yet 2023, because the irrigation season is still ongoing. So you have seen before that irrigated areas are concentrated in the south of Ukraine, and actually it's these are the areas where we see irrigation. That's where we have huge irrigation schemes, and those are the largest of Europe, some of the largest of Europe. And now it's we were also interested in seeing which of these big schemes are actually functional in the year 2022 and which are not. So we looked at the 20 largest schemes of Ukraine that represent about 60%, that cover about 60% of the irrigated area. And we compared the irrigated area identified for the year 2002 with the situation prior to the invasion. And what we see are that the largest drops of irrigated area are in areas temporarily not under government control or in zones with ongoing hostilities. But if we move further away from the hostility zone, we see no decrease in irrigated areas. So but now we want to also understand these areas that are affected, so where we see an impact of the invasion, negative impact on irrigated areas. So what are the crops that are cultivated there, and what is the productivity of these lands? So here's the next question to the audience. If you have joined just recently, there is an opportunity again to scan the QR code. And then we ask you to answer the question, what are the most important crops that are dependent on irrigation in Ukraine? So you can type your answer, and we will see then a word cloud appearing with your answers. So you can just like say what you think, like possible answers are maize, corn, banana, whatever you think, and we will see. So answers are coming in. So many people answered that wheat is an important irrigated crop. So regarding wheat, I can say that winter wheat is a crop that is harvested earlier, quite early in the season. So not at the end of the summer, but at the beginning of summer. So wheat is a crop that is a little bit less depending on irrigation. So there are large rain-fed areas of wheat in Ukraine, but still, you are right, there are quite considerable areas of wheat that are irrigated, because irrigation indeed increases the productivity, although wheat is harvested early in the season. So I provide now the answers. So here you see the statistics from remote sensing, and also the validation statistics from census data. So what we see here, soybean is the most important irrigated crop, followed by maize, sunflower, and then other cereals, which includes wheat and also barley. And then we have some small other types of crops like rapeseed, and under other crops we have vegetables, watermelon, and these other crops are a little bit underestimated by the remote sensing data. But otherwise, we see that the most important crops are export-oriented crops like soybean, maize, and they are important also for the revenue, so as economic factors. Now let's look at the impact on irrigated area of the invasion by comparing the data from the year 2022 to the previous years. So we see a 15% decline in the year 2022, which is about 65,000 hectares. And if we look at individual crops, we see that they are that the main crops are so more affected than the average. So we see for these main crops, we see decreases between 16 and 28% in irrigated areas. And now from the field survey, we only get like a qualitative assessment. But now with the remote sensing, this gives us the opportunity to get a quantitative assessment, but still look at a high resolution, zoom in and look where do we actually see the biggest changes in irrigated area or in water use. And as you see here, this is a map showing the south of Ukraine. So Kherson is the province where we have about 80% of the total irrigated land of Ukraine. And within the province, we see also with black outlines, we see the known command areas of irrigation systems. So these are these huge irrigation systems that I mentioned earlier, where water is pumped from the Dnipro river and distributed by center pivots. And so now if we look at the changes in evapotranspiration, so this is a layer completely independent of our cropland and irrigated area layer, we see that the biggest drops in crop water use, which is represented here by actual evapotranspiration, the largest drops are in areas with center pivots. So this indeed tells us that these center pivots are not functional in 2022. And we can quantify also the total irrigation water use, and we see that for the major crops, we have a decrease between 20 and 40% of irrigation water use in 2022, as with respect to prior to the invasion. And another data set, again, completely independent from the evapotranspiration layers and the crop masks, is the biomass production layer, which we use to translate then biomass production into yields. And here we also see this change map. And again, with the same picture, all these drops are happening within known command areas of irrigation systems, where we have in normal years these center pivot systems. So these are the hotspots of production loss. And it shows us that the irrigation sector was particularly vulnerable to the consequences of the invasion. And again, for individual crops, we see a decrease between 20 and 30% in irrigated production. Now I hand over again to Ranu.
All right. Thank you so much. Okay, so we'll shift out of the remote sensing and impact assessment of the RDNA and talk briefly about the Kakhovka Dam. Okay, so here we are back at the quiz. We promise we keep you on your toes in this session. So what percentage of Ukraine's irrigated area, now you've understood the figure, it's quite small, in this 25 million hectares, it's around 1.7%. And we all know, where is it located? Kherson, as we've been saying repeatedly. How much of that irrigated area do you think was supplied by the Kakhovka Dam? Is it A, less than 10%, B, between 10% and 60%, more than 60%, or lastly, none? The Kakhovka Dam is only used for hydropower. Hoping to hit my 50 again. Might take some time. This is a tough question. Okay, I'll try. All right, we're going up 40. All right, let's see the responses. Okay, so we have a majority of the participants saying that it's more than 60%, C. Then we have a bit of a split between the A's and B's, between 10 to 60 and less than 10. And a few of you think that it was, in fact, the Kafka Dam is only used for hydropower. Okay, what's the answer? So, in fact, the Kafka Dam, before we give you the right answer, is part of a cascade of reservoirs that are constructed on the Dnipro River system. And in fact, it's the last dam that you see in the diagram. And right before the Dnipro flows out to the sea. And this dam has multiple functions, or had multiple functions. Starting from hydropower, yes, indeed. The hydropower pump station was the infrastructure that was impacted by the explosion. Irrigation, industrial domestic water use, transport, fisheries, recreation, and flood protection. This is called a multi-sectoral dam, or multi-use dam. And this, what we tried to look at was satellite imagery to try to understand the flood inundation pathway when the hydropower pump station was impacted. There was a flood, as you all know, and we tried to understand, this is a flood imagery that was shared with us. The inundated area, as you can see in red, is flowing downstream of the river. The area of the dam is located in blue, where the box is. And then these colored pixels, blue, green, yellow, red, they show the depth of the flood. So where you see the red and orange is where it was the deepest depth of the flood, more than 5 millimeters. Although what we're seeing is the cropped area that was actually under flood, that was actually inundated, was less than 1,500 hectares, and irrigated area was less than 150 hectares. So that seems really small. I mean, you saw the farmer that responded had 1,400 hectares. But what I want to show to you with the next map is the answer to the question in the quiz. So, in fact, all of you are correct. The majority of you answered more than 60%. So the Kafka Dam, again, that's its location. The red is the inundation pathway. And in yellow, you see all the irrigation schemes that are fed by the Kafka Dam and its related pump stations. And that impacted more than 70% of all of the irrigation in Ukraine, around 305,000 hectares. That one event. So it's not the inundation or the actual flood that's impacting these systems, is that they no longer have water supply. And without water supply, they simply don't work, and they cannot provide water to those farms. In addition, there's an ensuing impact. You have to abandon that land. You have to abandon that infrastructure that farmers invest in. So a combination of that one event led to 70%. So we're talking 400,000 hectares under irrigation, 2%. But with one event, we lost access to water to 70% of Ukraine's irrigation systems. And that has the consequence of these operational losses. Damaged pump stations, potential production losses in some of the most important domestic and export-oriented crops. So one thing that I wanted to mention from Sylvan's presentation, when he showed you soybean and sunflower and maize and wheat, that Ukraine was exporting these crops, as well as using it for domestic production. Okay, over to you, Pulat.
Thank you very much, Ranu and Sylvan. This has been quite informative. So what we have done is basically, along with the work that we do in the World Bank and other countries, we create platforms for data sharing. And this data that we are producing using remote sensing is shared with our client countries and also accessible for the users that we have in the project. So similar to that, we have created a web platform. It's a water accounting platform that hosts all these information from the crop type to the yields, to the area that has been under basically the reduction of the area, how much water is consumed, what are the change in patterns what does the platform do is visualization of the data. It shows all the layers. It provides crop statistics basically on the cloud. User can choose any pixel, any field, any irrigation schemes, any oblast to see those numbers, to explore, to zoom in, and to see how those numbers look at. And we also provide satellite data, raw data that we have used within the same platform. So the idea behind these platforms that we create is not only to just basically share the data, but also to kind of empower our clients to be able to see for themselves actually how this data works, where are the good areas, maybe if they can actually see some areas or not. Basically, we are using remote sensing, right? So if some data doesn't match, we can actually use that information feedback to improve. And that is basically what we have also created here for Ukraine. But I'm going to tell you another story. We have heard about the invasion story. We have heard about the anthropogenic changes that is threatening Ukraine. But we are going to hear about climate change. That is a big driver of change that is happening for all of us. And in the context of Ukraine, we did a research to see what does it mean for Ukraine, a country that produces massive amount of food. It is a big food production country. A lot of countries in the world are dependent to the import of food from Ukraine. And what does it mean when we see the global warming? What does it mean? How do Ukraine be in 25 years, in 30 years, in 50 years? And then what it means for the global food security. To start, we have another quiz for you. And the idea is to get your opinions about what are the biggest risks of climate change for Ukraine's agriculture. Is it heat stress because of the warming? Is it rainfall variability because rainfall is going to change the patterns? Is it the hail? We have seen that in many areas. Are the floods, or a combination of all? I have 23 in. How much was the last one? 40. 40, okay. Let's see. I have 30 now. Okay, let's do the first sneak peek at the results. I have to go to the responses. And am I clicking? Yes. So majority are choosing all of the above. And then we have heat stress, rainfall variability, and basically floods. I mean, in a way, everybody's right. All of the above are going to influence crop production in Ukraine, as would the other countries. But crop production is predominantly limited by rainfall. Over the 2/3 of the crop production globally is limited by rainfall. That means that we are not achieving our yield potential, right? We know it. If you irrigate enough, your crop will produce the maximum amount of yield. If you reduce amount of irrigation or water for crop, linearly almost, the crop yield drops. So 20% reduction of crop access to water, be it from rainfall, be it from irrigation, will mean 20% drop from the potential yield of that crop. Hence, that in agriculture, in rain-fed systems, rainfall variability will play a major role, the biggest role, in how future will be for the food production. What do we do in response? We do irrigation, right? Irrigation is creating a buffer for us. When it's dry, we irrigate. When we have basically areas that are arid, we irrigate. We compensate the lack of access of crop to water because of insufficient rainfall by act of irrigation. But we have globally only 20% of croplands being irrigated, right? In a world that is kind of changing, that is basically the point to think about. Is 20% sufficient for the future or not? We also know that 40% of the food production globally happens through the irrigated crops. So think about it. 20% only irrigated, yet 40% is actually food production contribution of those irrigated areas. So just do the math. Irrigated agriculture almost has double yield than the rain-fed crops. Hence, irrigation not only increases the yield, and crop production, it creates that buffer for us. It creates that certainty, that it creates that rainfall variability over the years is going to less affect us because we are prepared. What will happen in the future with the climate change is the effect of rainfall insufficiency is going to increase. Another 90 million hectares of land are projected to suffer from insufficient rainfall. And that would translate to almost food production needed to feed 1.4 billion people. In a condition that we are struggling to find food enough for future population, 1.4 billion is a huge number. It probably is around 15% of the future population of the globe. And that is striking, because if we don't do anything, if we keep business as usual, if we stay as we are, if we don't respond to this, we are not only going to have the population increase, needing more food, we are going to have less food production because of climate change. Ukraine, same story. What we are seeing in Ukraine is that rainfall is going to decrease significantly during the summer months. And as you all know, summer months are the peak crop production month, right? We need water then. So, as you see all these areas in the Mediterranean area in the map, you can basically see these areas are affected. And Ukraine is just sitting here. And that is huge decrease when you look into the summer season, which also will translate to the reduction of the food production. We also see temperature increase. In this graph, you would see how temperature are projected to increase under different scenarios. Increase in temperatures will mean higher crop water demand. So not only we will have less water through rainfall, but also we have more needs for water because the crop water demand is going to go up, which put us in the even tougher situation. To look into whether rainfall is sufficient or not, we are using an index we call green water scarcity. Green water is the amount of water that is stored in the soil in the root zone as a direct basically consequences of rainfall. This is no irrigation. Assume there is no irrigation happening, no water is being added, how much rainfall comes in, how much rainfall of that rainfall stays in the root zone. And that tells us whether basically this amount over a certain period of crop growth, is it sufficient to grow that crop. You calculate the crop water demand, you know that, and you can actually use this simple way to understand whether we have sufficient rainfall to grow crops or not. Currently, this is the current situation. Currently, we see that basically rainfall insufficiency, these are areas with high green water scarcity in the southern Ukraine. As we see also in response to that, we see all the irrigated area being there, right? Very natural. Irrigated area are developed here in response to this. And this is the current situation. What it means is that actually, even if you take the current situation, because Ukraine is predominantly rain-fit at the moment, this means already we are losing that yield gap is about for 2 million people, like 2 million hectares are suffering from the lack of enough water for the crops. And when you look into the next timeline, if we assume a warming of 1.5 degrees, we see that area is growing, right? I mean, just look at this. Like we have the red area here, and then the next one in the 1.5. It's going to increase massively. Another 8 million hectares of land are going to be suffering from lack of access to water that is enough for crop growth. Next timeline, if we look into the 3 degrees warming, which we expect to happen somewhere between 2040 to 2080, like they say another 50 years or so, we will see almost entire Ukraine will have trouble with supporting the rain-fit system. 19 out of 25 million hectares are going to have insufficiency of rainfall to grow crop as compared to 2 million of today. And then we will see the increasing number of months that rainfall is not sufficient to meet that periodic, but basically time scale of the crop water demand. And this will have significant impact on the agricultural productivity and poses significant risks for farmers to be able to continue cropping. Crop failure could happen, loss of basically livelihood could happen, loss of global food issues would happen. When we look into calorics demand, just we can convert based on how much average human being is consuming calories a day, and considering all the efficiencies along the way, we see that basically currently the yield gap that there is amounting to around food for 25 million people. Next timeline, that'll be 45 million people. The timeline after would be 54 million people, right? That's huge. That's almost population of a country. And that is where the main story is also there for the global community. Ukraine, a country, but it has a huge impact on those food security of the global. What would be the prices? What would be the access to food for other people and those who are actually importing from Ukraine? What we see irrigation is an adaptation strategy for us. As the climate change happening, warming is happening, we can get ahead of this for food production by being prepared. And that preparedness happens through irrigation. Currently, as my colleague Ranu said, and Silvan, we have 1.7% of the croplands in Ukraine being irrigated, only 1.7%. We also know that, quantitatively, that 50% more yields are gained in the irrigated area in Ukraine. And we know that irrigation reduces water stress. That's just science. Whenever the rainfall is short, end of the rainfall season, you just irrigate. And then it also has implications for farmers, because farmers, by irrigation, would have that buffer, would have that insurance that this crop failure will not happen. They would not be exposed to climatic risks. Hence, what is needed is basically for the future to be able to kind of mitigate these and adapt to these changes is irrigation. To sustain food production in the near future, like we are talking about 10, 15 years from now, all these areas that you see in orange are the areas that could be prioritized for irrigated areas, for expansion of irrigation, right? We have the current irrigated area in dark green. We have the rain-fed area that could probably in a shorter, like a medium term, continue to be rain-fed in basically light green. And we have the orange area. The orange area is where we should focus, right? To do irrigation, however, we know that we need to store water. It just doesn't happen on its own. We can't take it from river all the time. So we have to think about the storage development. We have to examine the current storage capacity for any additional irrigation and understand how much more do we need, how much more canals and pipes do we need to build to transport water, and then also what are the sustainable boundaries of this? We are talking massive scale, right? So hence it's very important not to just go ahead and then say every orange area needs to be irrigated. We need to do the next step towards understanding what are the envelopes of sustainability here? What is the infrastructure need? What are the costs of those? And how do we go from this map basically to a map that kind of gives us a roadmap to expansion of irrigation for Ukraine? And I'm hoping that this would be something that we could do in our next steps. So handing out back to you.
Thank you so much, Pulad. Thank you so much, Silvan. And thank you to the audience for participating in those tough quizzes. Well, it's a bit of a dire picture, but I think, as Pulad pointed out, there are opportunities. And so bringing us back now to really talk through these points is our panel discussion. Thank you both. I'd like to invite the panelists to come to the stage. Winston, Suzanne. And we also have our panelists that are connected via Zoom online from Kyiv. Okay, before we get started, I just want to take a moment to introduce our panelists. Winston, you're all familiar with, and you've met already. Online, we have Natalia Latish, who's the director of the State Agency of Water Resources, the government of Ukraine. And one thing I want to say is all of the work and the evidence you have seen presented today has been the hard work and partnership of this agency. All the data collection, the analysis, the validation, the map development, the tool, it belongs to them, it is created by them, and it is for them. So they have been our partners throughout this each step in the last year and a half. We also have the pleasure of Mr. Taras Kot, First Deputy Head of the State Agency of Melioration and Fisheries of Ukraine within the Ministry of Agriculture. And we have Suzanne Scheimer here in the room with us, Associate Professor of Water Law and Diplomacy of IHE Delft. Okay, we're gonna start and open the round of questions, a few questions from my side, and then we'll give the audience an opportunity to also ask questions in just a moment. My first question is for Natalia. Hope the Zoom is okay and they can hear me well. Great. Natalia, hi, welcome and happy Independence Day.
Вітаємо, пані Наталі.
Доброго дня, шановні присутні. Я хотіла би подякувати команді Світового банку за запрошення доєднатися до Всесвітнього тижня води. І це досить символічно, що панельна дискусія присвячена впливу води, впливу війни та клімату на водну безпеку України відбувається саме сьогодні, коли Україна відзначає свій 32-й рік незалежності. І ще, пані Рано, я хотіла би...
Sorry, if I may ask you to pause. I will just ask my question first, and then I'll turn to you to be able to answer the question, if you just give me a moment. Okay, so the first question I have for you is, in this last year and a half, what, in your opinion, are the most significant damages to water resources management? And how do you think the invasion has influenced the water security of Ukraine? So just a moment, I'll let the translator, who will translate this question in Ukrainian, back to Natalia. If you just give us a moment. Over to the interpreter, please. Channel 2.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for the World Bank for the invitation to the International Water Days. And this is a very good opportunity for us to discuss the very urgent issues faced by Ukraine as a result of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Thank you.
Так, я би ще хотіла зазначити, що зараз на території України лунає повітряна тривога.
I would also like to say that right now that we have the air raid alarm signal in Ukraine.
Так, і почну відповідати на запитання пані Рану. Так, водна безпека є складовою національної безпеки України, і вода є ключовим елементом для забезпечення стабільного функціонування багатьох систем та важливим фактором для забезпечення сталого розвитку та глобальної безпеки.
And now I will start answering your question. Yes, water security is one of the key components of the Ukrainian national security, and it provides the key support to many economic sectors and infrastructure.
Ведення активних бойових дій на значній території нашої держави є невідворотним фактом ураження нашого водогосподарського комплексу. Війна Російської Федерації проти України стала загрозою для забезпечення водної безпеки України, створює нові глобальні ризики та породжує гуманітарну кризу, порушуючи базові права людини та вражаючи буквально кожну сферу нашого життя та діяльності населення країни.
The hostilities in Ukraine really results in huge damages of water supply systems and water security, of the national water security. And it also damages the infrastructure and economic facilities, and also results in humanitarian disaster and environmental disaster.
Національна безпека України є вразливою в частині задоволення водних потреб, оскільки залежить від поверхневих джерел. Чиста вода – це важливий ресурс для здоров'я людей і природи, регулювання клімату та має вагоме значення для економічної, продовольчої та енергетичної безпеки. 90% потреб населення та економіки України у воді забезпечують саме поверхневі води. 74% питних та господарсько-побутових потреб забезпечуються з поверхневих водойм.
Our water security is really very much vulnerable because it very much depends on the surface water. 90% of water for economic needs are provided from the surface waters, and also 74% of drinking needs in drinking water are provided from the surface waters.
Так, вже більше 500 днів об'єкти водозабезпечення під ракетними ударами країни-терориста, під постійною загрозою функціонування наших питних водозаборів та подача води населенню, а також належна якість цієї води. Уражені війною території та населення, що в них проживають, залишаються без належного доступу до води та санітарних умов, що може також спричинити інфекції, віруси, хвороби. Через війну Російської Федерації проти України майже 5 мільйонів людей в Україні мають проблеми з доступом до питної води.
So it is more than 500 days that we are under continuous aggression of Russian Federation, and including our pumping facilities and water supply facilities to households, and this results in decrease in quantity and quality of water received by our people. Many people really suffer because of limited or no access to quality drinking water. Currently, 5 million Ukrainians suffer because of absolutely no access to drinking water, which results in different infections, viruses, and diseases.
Так, відбудова інфраструктури водопостачання та водовідведення – це першочергові базові інвестиції у майбутнє здорової нації нашої держави. Також значні, а іноді невідповідні руйнування водогосподарської інфраструктури, зокрема гідротехнічних споруд, систем централізованого водопостачання та водовідведення міст, об'єктів гідротехнічної мережі, зрошувальних систем і дренажу приводять до непродуктивної втрати води.
So reconstruction of our water supply and irrigation system is the best investment in the future of our country. Also, we should reconstruct better our systems that have been damaged because the current obsolete systems result in significant losses of water.
Thank you so much. Thank you, and we fully agree. We'll just get to the point on reconstruction in just a moment, but I want to build on what Ms. Latish has very eloquently explained, the extent of the damage, and want to turn for a moment to Mr. Kott with a question also related. We learned about drinking water supply and water resources and the impact of that on human lives as well as infrastructure. But Mr. Kott, maybe you could shed some light on, from your perspective, where do you think the significant damages are to the irrigation sector in Ukraine because of the invasion?
Hello to everyone. It's very honorable to take part in this discussion. So in our country, irrigation process That is why damages in this sector influences on other spheres of economy. So first of all, it is the damage of irrigation systems and channel and pump lines in Kherson and Zaporizhzhia regions, especially meaning the systems that which are located on the left bank of the Dnieper River, and systems of Mykolaiv region, which were under the occupation. Second issue is the destruction of the Kakhovsky water reservoir, which were this reservoir was the water intake source for two big channels, meaning the South Crimea channel and Kakhovsky main channel. So after the destruction of the reservoir, without the water source, left 12 irrigation system in the Zaporizhzhia region, total irrigation area more than 68,000 hectares, 5 system in the Dnipropetrovsk region, total irrigation area it's 4,600 hectares, and 14 system in Kherson region, about 234,000 hectares. So now we can see that if in 2021 we had more than 515,000 hectares of irrigation, in August 2023 we have only 104,000 hectares. So the next factor is destruction of still in the irrigation machines, especially, as I said, on the left bank of the Dnieper River. Also, a very important factor is the state of electrical networks and the electricity generation. We understand that the stable work, without the stable work of the networks, it is nearly impossible to improve and develop irrigation systems and agriculture. So next issue is the market and sales of the agricultural products, storage facilities, and port operations. All these spheres are on the constant attack by the Russian military. And of course, the problem of the mine cleaning of the agricultural land and irrigation system. That's the biggest problem, I think so. And I think that with your help, we will be able to solve all this problem and build better than it was. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Cotton. Thank you for pointing out some of the most important damages that are outside of simply the canals and the dams. It's the electricity, it's the mining, and these are these consequences where the irrigation sector cannot function. So thank you for that. But actually, you ended on a way looking forward and this point of building back better. So I want to turn now to Winston with a question. Now, in a situation, hopefully soon in the future, what do you think are the opportunities that we have that the World Bank can support Ukraine in building, in fact, back better?
Okay, yeah, no, thank you. There are obviously lots of opportunities to build on the rich global experience that exists out there in terms of how do we modernize and make our irrigation and drainage systems much more resilient and much more reliable and much more farmer-oriented. But I think there's certainly a bigger question, which is what is the future of the agriculture sector in Ukraine and what will it look like moving forward? I think the results that were shown are quite compelling in terms of this need to expand and do more irrigation, but we should also remember that irrigation is not free. It costs money and it's an investment. And so with the current cropping system that exists and the markets that are out there, is irrigation the right way forward? I think that's a question that we at the World Bank with our partners in Ukraine will be exploring, particularly for new irrigated areas. What will you grow in these areas, or will you just convert what is there and just add irrigation? I mean, I think the profitability question and issues around where these things will be exported It was mentioned about the logistics, storage. I mean, there's a lot to unpack before just jumping in and building irrigation systems back better. But a few things I think, certainly as we're already seeing, and as I mentioned in my opening remarks, coming from India and all of a sudden working in Ukraine, where you already see high efficiency systems, sprinklers, center pivots. I mean, obviously there's more scope for that. Obviously, in terms of storage, which Poulat also mentioned, and here we're not necessarily talking about big reservoirs, but just buffering storage. How will you manage that future uncertainty? There's a lot of good experiences around the world in using buffering storage systems. Taras also mentioned the whole energy aspect. I can't emphasize enough the numbers of pumps I've seen in complete disrepair, and access to fuel and parts is always an issue. So can we do better with pumping systems and or convert things into solar and whatnot? I think the groundwater issue is something to think about also in the future, and I think this is an area where there are opportunities to revisit how groundwater is being managed, and to see if there are opportunities to do more on conjunctive use. I mean, we talk a lot about conjunctive use, and I know it maybe loses a little bit of currency because it's so hard to do in practice, but maybe there's an opportunity here to improve on that. And just finally, I think, again, going back to my first visits in 2012, the whole financial sustainability of these systems and really thinking about, whatever gets built, yes, we want to make it better in terms of its flexibility, reliability, et cetera, but also let's make it better in terms of it being financially sustainable, and that's always a difficult area to tackle, but I think hopefully we can share with our Ukrainian friends how other countries are dealing with this, because again, irrigation's not cheap, but if we do want to feed a future bigger population, and Ukraine of course is going to will be part of that discussion, we also need to think about the financial sustainability of these systems. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Winston. That's a lot of food for thought. So it's not just about climate resilience, it's financial resilience of these systems. I want to shift gears. We've heard from the practitioners, from the decision makers, but I want to turn to the academic community and also from a governance perspective. It's one thing we have not yet talked about. So for Suzanne, I wanted to ask you, in your work and also with the other organizations you're engaged with, what do you see as the biggest policy implications of this invasion on water security into the country, and also some of the evidence that we presented for water security today? Sorry, Suzanne, you'll have to keep your headphones on for the Zoom participants to hear you. Thank you.
Okay. It's always strange if you hear yourself double.
It's double, I know. I've been having that weird moment.
I'll do my best. Well, thanks for the question, and thanks for being on this session. I don't want to repeat anything that's been said. I think we've touched on very important things, such as the destruction of infrastructure and what that means for irrigation, what that means for income, and so on. But I would maybe like to add to that dimension that this is all very human disaster. This is all very human catastrophes, which we should not only look at by themselves right now, but also in terms of what the long-term consequences are. And that's how we get to policy, how we get to governance consequences. So questions how, for example, in the future, decisions will be taken about where to reconstruct, what to prioritize, where to invest, not only from what is absolutely very important, an economic perspective, but also from a social perspective. We're talking employment when we talk about agriculture. It's not only in Ukraine, but in many countries, a very important sector of employment, but also a very important sector for social cohesion, for stability at the local level. So I think here we're looking at questions of long-term government legitimacy, long-term stability of governments, or if we look at the other side of the coin, also risks of instability if certain groups, and we know that from a lot of conflict and post-conflict countries elsewhere in the world, if certain groups feel they're being advantaged or disadvantaged in decision-making around these questions. So I think that's one important policy dimension to keep in mind right now, where admittedly still very little can be done, unfortunately, in the situation, but also when we look at the future. And just to add another dimension, I wanted to add the transboundary dimension as well. because obviously Ukraine doesn't exist in a vacuum, but has neighboring countries, but also exists in a broader international context that some people touched upon already in terms of food security, bread protests, bread riots that we've seen in other countries emerging as a consequence of the reduced exports from Ukraine, which have led to instability, to policy issues there, but also to name, and I think that's sometimes a bit underrepresented, the transboundary implication in terms of, for example, when Kakhovka Dam happened, the pollution that flooded down the Dnipro River into the Black Sea, which is a transboundary water body, but then also towards the Danube Delta, a totally different river, which is a very important ecosystem, and there had its effects. So immediately you have governance policy implications, not only at the local and at the national level in Ukraine, which is complicated enough already, but also at the transboundary level. And maybe on a last governance and more legal note that we haven't touched upon yet, but that I think is worth highlighting, we're here also seeing yet another case internationally in terms of how water resources are being used as a weapon, or at least being affected by war, by violence. And this is in spite of the fact that we have a relatively good legal framework at the global level in place to prevent this from happening. So maybe in terms of wider policy implications for us as the international community as a whole, that's also yet another important wake-up call to finally make these instruments that are there really working.
Wow, that's quite a number of facets that we had not even yet mentioned. So thank you so much, Suzanne, for bringing the inclusion point, the transboundary point, and in fact that this is bleeding into many aspects of our lives, from governance dimensions for all countries in different ways. So it's not a localized issue. So thank you very much. I want to give the chance to the audience for a moment for another round of questions. Just a moment. You will actually have the chance to go back to your Polev and enter any question that you want to ask. And I will be able to choose a question here, so we'll make it. And anyone from the online audience can also enter their questions in this manner so that I can actually read them here. Thank you. So we'll just give it a minute, let some questions come in. First come, first serve. Let me see if I can get this to work. Are responses coming in? I'm not sure. Okay, there we go. We're seeing them come in. Okay, so this question is about the water quality implications, about climate change. We're looking at some things on soil degradation. We'll also give some of the presenters a chance to respond as well. Okay, so maybe I start to pick some of these questions and pose. We'll start with the online audience, our Zoom panelists. Maybe if I can turn to you, Natalia, and I'll try to start with, could you, as she mentioned already, could you speak a bit to the drinking water situation in Ukraine? And what are the authorities doing today to ensure access to safe drinking water for those that are not available? I think over to the interpreter, please, to translate.
Так, уряд України вживає всіх дієвих заходів щодо забезпечення населення питною водою. Наразі в нас впроваджуються експериментальні проекти щодо наповнення водосховищ і перекидання води з одного водосховища до іншого для того, щоб забезпечити міста питною водою більш-менш належної якості.
Right now, the government of Ukraine has been doing everything possible in order to ensure that the population has access to high-quality drinking water. We have several experimental projects being implemented. For example, we have projects related to the creation of and filling in of reservoirs with drinking water, and the transfer of water from one reservoir to another reservoir, so that the cities could exchange and have access to quality drinking water.
Також проводяться зараз збір інформації щодо формування програми по глобальному вирішенню даної проблеми.
Right now, we also collect information in order to be able to globally tackle this issue in Ukraine.
Thank you so much for that response. I'm going to turn back to the panelists, if we can have this. Okay, to Suzanne. You mentioned, the question is that do you or the academia or wider group of experts already have particular steps that you've taken? And what are your proposals?
Okay, on point 3, it would be helpful if I now remembered what point 3 was that I made. I didn't count them. But I think generally academia, as everyone else, of course, has a role to play in addressing these challenges now, but especially also when what I think is very important to talk about rebuilding, not reconstructing. And while academia might not necessarily be in the driver's seat here, I think we do have an important role to play to assess the impacts and the potential. I mean, it was presented by Poulad and you in the presentation, how important it is to have a clear picture of where the damages are, but also to know where the climate change impact is hitting and how, and then to see how to build back better. But I think also, and I think that's a really a key point for me, I think Ukraine has already been facing and will, with all the things that happened in the war now in terms of lives lost, people having left the country, will even more be facing an issue of capacity, workforce capacity in terms of people operating irrigation infrastructure, other water infrastructure, but also academic capacity in terms of people doing analysis, advising governments and so on. And I think here academia really has an important role to play, not only in Ukraine, but worldwide, to help rebuild and build better this capacity. And also, of course, because I think my third point was the one on the international humanitarian law, I think there it's also very important that academia does, and we do that, does help collect the evidence for that and provide evidence to those who will hopefully eventually be dealing legally with all that happened.
Absolutely. So it's not just building back better infrastructure, it's actually the human capacity that we need to build back better in Ukraine as well, just as much as emphasis as the physical infrastructure. Okay, I want to turn back to the Zoom panelists, to Mr. Kott. What we have an audience member who's asked us for irrigation, how do you see damages to on-farm, which is the private infrastructure from that qualitative survey that we showed you from farmers, and also off-farm infrastructure, and how will this be translated into future programs?
Catch it. Can you give me the translation, please?
Can you please repeat the question?
Would you like me to repeat the question?
Yes, please.
Yes, no problem. For the irrigation sector, the audience question is, how do you see that these damages that have happened to on-farm and off-farm infrastructure, how do you see the importance of this damages, I think what the person is trying to say, and how will the consequence of these damages be translated into future programs to rebuild and recover?
Стосовно сектору зрошення, запитання від учасника полягає в тому, як ви розглядаєте ці пошкодження об'єктів інфраструктури на фермах та за межами ферм, і що важливіше, наскільки вони важливими є, і як вони будуть втілюватися в майбутніх програмах для вирішення всіх цих проблем?
First of all, the government and the Ministry of Agriculture right now have the program for the for the year 2023 for the support of the farmers who is buying the new irrigation machines and some equipment for irrigation systems. So the government is already work out this program for this year, and I think that it will be this support program will work next year.
Okay, could you tell us a bit what is in this support program? What is included in this support program?
In the support program, included the support of the farmers who's working on the irrigation system and on the irrigated lands. The biggest problem for the farmers is the lack of the irrigation machines.
Exactly, with the damage.
Yes, it was damaged or stilled. Regarding the storage facilities, with this, they handle this problem themselves, and the irrigation technique is an issue.
Okay, thank you so much for laying that out. So clearly there is some short-term support being provided, and perhaps there's also some medium and long-term planning already begun. Maybe I want to turn back to the panelists here, and another question from the audience for Winston. What is the nearest future plans? So I think that would mean short-term plans of the World Bank for Ukraine's irrigation.
Well, I frankly don't know. We're still trying to figure it out. I mean, I think everyone can appreciate that the situation is evolving. We don't know exactly when the war will end. Certainly, if you know the history of the World Bank, and our first loans were to the reconstruction of Europe after the war. So the bank is no stranger to reconstruction efforts. But I think what is different from the experience, post World War II to how we approach reconstruction and how we do these kinds of damage and needs assessment, it is with the mind to not just reconstruction, but really thinking about the future. So, as I have emphasized before, part of what has been, a continued journey with our Ukrainian friends and counterparts is the discussion about, okay, we need infrastructure investments, we need infrastructure modernization, and we need institutional modernization. We have a funny saying, and those of you who know me are probably sick and tired of me repeating this, but we don't just want to fix pipes, but we want to fix the institutions that fix the pipes. So we want to help the Ukrainian government in these investments and what Taras just described. Okay, we can give equipment, but can we ensure that that equipment is properly maintained, that owners really know how to operate, can really get as much out of those assets for as long as their useful lives, right? And I think that is that's a different perspective that exists today when we think about reconstruction efforts in contrast to in the very beginning when the bank was first formed.
Yeah, and to build on that, I think the question is where infrastructure, right? And what kind of infrastructure, what size? And those are big questions that as you rightly say, Winston, we don't have the answer to, but I think that's where the next steps is trying to find answers to some of those questions with our partners, of course, our other financing partners, and of course, the partners in Ukraine. I also saw maybe one last round of questions from the audience. An interesting question about what these lessons are from Ukraine. Can't seem to find it, but I'll try to summarize if I remember correctly. So this is for open question for any of the panelists to jump in if a few of you want to answer. This experience that we're all going through, and it feels like the globe is going through this experience in many ways, in small, big. What can this experience teach us? What are the lessons we are learning and still probably have yet to learn? And then maybe that's a good answers and responses question to end with in this session is, what do you think this experience is going to teach us? So start with Suzanne and then go around to all the panelists.
Okay, I'll keep it brief also because I think the main people who should answer that is our two Ukrainian colleagues who unfortunately can't be with us here today. I'll focus on the governance dimension of lessons learned. I think in such an extreme situation of an invasion, what we know, and I'm here speaking generally from experiences elsewhere in the world and what research shows us, is that in the beginning, the people, the country tends to stand together and tends to go through hardship together. But as the country comes out of this, gets into a post-conflict stage, we see all sorts of old but also new tensions coming up and reforms or initiatives that have been undertaken before a war or a conflict tend to cripple, tend to slow down. And in Ukraine, for example, we've seen very important reforms when it comes to legal framework, when it comes to governance reforms before the war, but there is a risk that these things get stalled right now and for very understandable reasons, but they're not being taken up again. Or that investments which have, for example, in the water sector already been very low before the war, was, I think it's less than 0.2% of the GDP being invested in the water sector before the war, that these things get stalled even more, which then tends to lead to tension between different sectors. Everyone's, of course, competing afterwards for government attention, for investments, for capacity, and so on. And that, if not managed well, and that's where the support of international partners, including academia, is also needed, if not managed well, can just lead to new tensions that will stall recovery even more in the future.
Absolutely. Well said, Suzanne. Thank you so much. Winston, over to you.
Yeah, well, I mean, the story on what our lessons learned is still being written, right? So I don't think we fully know. But for me, the biggest thing I walk away from is just how sort of fragile food systems are. I mean, it's kind of interesting, when this war started and getting grains out, it's like, okay, it's an issue. But then you just start hearing about what this means for Africa, a whole continent elsewhere, right? It shows you how connected and, again, perhaps fragile our energy systems are. And so, I always hated the word nexus because I never really understood what it meant. But for some, I think this kind of gives me some insights, just, again, how everything is connected. And it's obvious, obviously, but I think we are living through a period of time right now where we see how our economies are connected, how our food systems are connected, how our energy systems are connected, and those vulnerabilities. And so, for me, more and more, I mean, this building back better idea. Oh, thank you. I know, it's a great idea. This building back better idea has much more currency for me now. It's like, okay, like politicians say it, but now I kind of feel like, okay, I can understand really what is needed more than before. So.
Absolutely. So the nexus causes the conflicts and the damages, but the nexus is the way to some of the solutions as well. So thank you, Winston. Okay, I want to turn to our esteemed panelists on Zoom, and maybe Natalia, over to you first. I'll repeat perhaps the question for the interpreter. So, what are some of the lessons learned that we are learning today from the invasion in Ukraine? Just give it a moment.
Я почула. Так. Які уроки для всього світу? Ми повинні робити прогнозування і програми, як діяти в таких ситуаціях, на які ми не розраховували. Як, наприклад, підрив Каховської ГЕС. Це критична ситуація, до якої ніхто не був готовий. Тобто прорахунків, що робити, як забезпечувати населення питною водою, як буде аграрний сектор вести себе у цьому разі. Тому і ще те, що ми проводимо постійний моніторинг. Це досить великий кластер інформації, який можна буде потім використовувати. Як відновлювати воду від хімічного забруднення, а також забруднення від тієї військової техніки, яка знаходиться зараз у водних об'єктах, та паливо-мастильних матеріалів, які в великій кількості потрапляють у водні об'єкти, як очищувати наші водні ресурси.
Yes, so my reply to your question is that we should, what are the lessons? that we should focus and pay more attention to the focus and to the emergency programs to potentially unexpected situation or emergency situations, and what should be done, especially in agricultural sector and also for water security in such emergency situations. So we should have prepared action plans and programs for such situations. The second point, the second lesson is that we should keep on monitoring over the situation and collect all the data, what would be the grounds and basis for decision making. And we also should develop the plan for cleaning water, which is currently cannot be used as before because of contamination result because of the war, since a lot of military vehicles and also fuels and oils are in the water, which makes water dirty, contaminated, and not usable.
Okay, thank you so much. So that's really nice to hear these three lessons. One, preparedness is key. One can never anticipate events like this, but it's important to prepare these emergency action plans and think about monitoring. And so I think some of the tools, for example, that we've used, and again, back to this theme of innovation, Earth observation, remote sensing, and the water counting digital platform, this is a way to continue that monitoring today and in the future. And of course, the points of water quality are fundamental as the environmental and biological systems are equally impacted. So thank you so much. Now, for the final word, I would like to turn to Mr. Kott and to also give his feedback to the question, where do you think are the biggest lessons learned so far in this experience?
I absolutely agree with Natalia that in such important branches as the water sector and irrigation, you must be ready and have plan for the worst situation you can imagine. And only then it will be easier to overcome all the problems we have.
Okay, you heard it here. Plan, plan, plan for the unforeseeable. Well, I really want to give my heartfelt thanks to this incredible panel of incredible decision makers, practitioners, academics who are giving their time at all kinds of events, even today, under a very precarious situation in Ukraine, to be present and to share with you all this knowledge and the thinking for the way forward. So on that note, I think there's definitely a positive move forward, and I definitely believe that that's the only way forward, is that with all the work and the learning and the technologies and the collective brain power that we presented to you today and of the audience. So I would definitely want to thank the audience. You were great. You participated actively and got almost all your questions correct. So thank you so much. And thank you to Winston and Suzanne for being excellent. Thank you.